Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Workplaces That Work conversation. I love hosting these spaces with experts, leaders that come from all walks of work within the workplace. And I know that a lot of times these topics are things that happen at the leadership level. I like to bring it closer to everybody. I work a lot more with around ERG strategy. I'm an employee resource group consultant, and a lot of the symptoms that we see at certain levels, we know that it's a symptom of something deeper at the leadership level, at the organizational level. So I love to host guests who are experts in their niches and have found a lot of success. I've done a lot of work around different topics. And Liz is here today to chat with me around succession planning. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Dr. Lola. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to be here with you. All right. Before I start to ask you some of the questions around this topic, could you take a minute to sort of give us a brief bio about yourself so people know who we're listening to here?
Certainly. So, what I do with my clients are primarily three things. Number one, I work with my clients who are typically C suite executives, C suite teams, business owners, and boards of directors on number one, strategic planning. So, I facilitate their strategic planning projects, retreats, to help them create very clear, concise strategic plans to guide where they need to take their organizations or businesses over the next 3, 5, 10, or more years. As part of those conversations, invariably, we get around to discussing, given where this organization needs to go in the future, who's going to lead it and what type of talent do you need? So we get into succession and workforce planning conversations and identifying, missing positions, but more importantly, missing skill gaps or needed skill sets going forward. And then the third thing that I do with my clients is I spend a lot of my time one-on-one or one-to-group business advisory and coaching. So helping the leaders or leadership teams or ownership teams identify specific steps they need to take to implement either the strategic plan or the succession or workforce plans that they've created, or how to deal with real-time situations with personnel issues, business strategies, those types of things. So in a nutshell, that's what I do and who I am.
Oh, well, you have fun, and and I definitely wanted to get your take on something. I was at a nonprofit conference this week, and we were talking about, and they were sharing with us some of the data around how a lot of CEOs in the nonprofit sector in 2020 there was a trend where a lot of people that were ready to retire changed their mind and decided to stay. And when I think of the nonprofit sector, I think that kind of made sense because, a lot of these leaders and the business and the nonprofits that they serve, all of these things moved. There were so many moving parts in 2020. And so a lot of turnover, a lot of retention, CEOs that stayed longer. And now, a couple of years after that, a lot of people are leaving. And I wanted to get your take on that. Just curious, what are you seeing as far as trends with leadership and retirement within the industry, commercial
Well,
space?
it's interesting that you had that experience and that data from the nonprofit conference you attended, because with my client base, it was actually somewhat different in 2020 and what we're experiencing now. So in 2020, what my clients experienced is a number of them saw leadership departures sooner rather than expected. So there were a number of leaders, even some business owners, who hadn't planned on retiring in 2020, were close enough. We're within 1 to 3 or maybe even 5 years out of retiring. But when 2020 hit, many of them decided, you know what, I'm close enough to retirement. I'm just going to leave now. And so there was a big wave of retirements within my client base in 2020. What happened then after that, really around 2023, 2024, 2025 in particular, there was another big surge in retirements because from my observations and in talking with my clients, the the frustration with the just the never ending acceleration of technology changes, and the business ramifications because of them, but linked with the intensity of the tensions within the workplace due to political and societal differences and the clashes and the results of behavior in the workplace, my client base saw a lot of retirements in 2025 and started spiking up in 2024, with a lot of leaders basically saying, you know what, I'm done. I'm done now. What's interesting though, Lola, is what I'm seeing now in 2026 is I'm kind of seeing my clients have kind of ridden that tide, and those that are in leadership positions that are looking at potential retirements within the next 3, 5, or 7 years are now saying, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to ride this out, but I'm not going to tolerate some of the behavior, some of the attitudes, some of the situations that we've somehow accepted as normal over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm done dealing with it. While I'm still here, we're going to change how we behave, change how we look at our workplace culture, and whether we're working remote, hybrid, or in person, we're going to work differently. We're going to work together and collaboratively, and we're going to do this in a much more effective way than what we've experienced in the last couple of years.
I love it. That is encouraging to hear. Like, you know, enough with the riding the wave or just doing things the way we're doing. Like, if you're going to be there, actually making the difference. And I think that's encouraging to hear that there are leaders making those decisions. All right. So a little bit about, I kind of pulled out the succession planning. I know you do a lot of like strategic planning conversations. I pulled out the succession planning because there's also another thread that kind of comes up with employee resource groups, which a lot of times are, you know, mid-level employees, and just looking at the structure of employee resource groups. These are most times informal groups being led by volunteers and managed by HR or somebody in the DAI team. So this is a little bit of a pipeline conversation. So I wanted to first start with you. What does succession planning really mean? Maybe for those that are listening in your world and in the workplace.
So how I define succession planning and work with my clients when we're working on succession planning is we look at the entire organization, not just the senior suite, not just certain critical positions. We look enterprise wide and we go deep. And succession planning is not a project, it is a mindset. And it is a mindset about developing skills and depth so that when transitions occur, they are seamless. And to that point, it really is a situation where, you know, you alluded to your ERGs that are quite often, you know, supported by HR. I am very vocal with my clients that succession planning is not HR's responsibility. It is leadership's responsibility. HR can help orchestrate and facilitate, but it's leadership's responsibility because it's a mindset about building depth and agility.
Yeah, I love it. That yeah, it is a mindset, and I'm glad those conversations that need to happen are happening at the leadership level at the organization, because I think that's what it is. Can you explain a little bit what the difference between emergency coverage? I feel like this already is the answer to what we're talking about, but I've heard the phrase emergency coverage, right, within the workplace when something happens, and then intentional leadership pipeline development.
Well, you know, it's actually, they're two distinct things, but one, again, when I work with my clients, one feeds the other. So quite often, you know, clients will reach out and say, either we have to do succession planning, or I want to sell my business and I need to do succession planning. How do we do this? And the immediate mindset is, this is so massive and so overwhelming, I can't do it. But what I do quite often as a first step with my clients is emergency planning, emergency staff planning, is let's figure out, if something happens to you and you're unavailable for a day or a week, who do you have on hand that can either individually or collectively slide in and cover some of your critical tasks? So I have them create basically emergency staffing trees to start to identify if Lola's out and we can't reach her, who are her 1, 2, or 3 backups that can hobble something together and keep this going until she comes back. Having that information is a first step because it will obviously identify who has the capabilities to keep things going. But also for a leader, what it tells me is if there is no one that can back you up, then you are what I call a hotspot. And yes, it means you're magnificent, but it also means you're a danger point for me. Because if something happens to you, your critical areas of responsibility are held hostage until either you come back or we find some other expert someplace, typically externally, to come in and figure out what you did to try to pick up the pieces. That's dangerous. So it's a long answer to your question. Emergency planning with my clients is a first step to start the idea of succession planning, to start having those conversations.
Yeah. So are we talking about replacing people or talking about having a plan to continue work when the roles, when there's a gap, right? Is it more of like a replacement plan or is it a plan for work?
Well, what typically what I do is it could be replacement planning, but so let me back up again. And when I was describing for you and those that are joining us on the live, it's what I do with my clients is first we do strategic planning and then I do succession planning and then we coach and advise on how to implement those plans. The reason I intentionally mention that sequence is the strategic plan drives succession planning because it's going to drive the skill sets, the positions, the organization of the company going forward. And then succession planning helps populate the right positions and people and skill sets to enable that the strategic plan to come to life. So to your question about, filling roles or things like that, it's looking at, again, what does your division need? What does your team need? What does the company need? And then what positions do you have right now that make sense in moving that forward, or what positions will you need moving forward, and what skill sets will those positions need to be able to demonstrate to do the jobs they're going to need to be able to do going forward. Now, again, just like emergency planning with my clients, we map that out for what is our current organizational structure and people, and what are their current skill sets. And by the way, where do we have gaps in how they're currently doing their jobs? We need to address that. But then looking forward, how does the organizational structure potentially change? Positions potentially change. And as they do, given who's in the current position, what needs to happen for them to be able to fulfill the revised position responsibilities? And for any new positions, where might we source that talent either internally or from the outside? So, filling positions and roles and responsibilities and planning for the future are somewhat complementary. They happen for current positions as well as future roles.
Yeah. Thank you for breaking that down. And I think talking about those differences and the sequence is also important. So let's talk a little bit about where succession planning breaks down, because I think that really is the crux of the work. I wanted you to set the stage and talk about what it is and break down some of these terms. But what are some ways that those gaps begin to occur, or maybe the triggers, or when they think it exists or is not? Right.
Well, I see succession planning breaking down in a couple different ways, and I'll just kind of outline some of the biggest misconceptions or obvious gaps that I see with clients when I first start working with them. And the first biggest one is number one, I alluded to this already, is there's an assumption that succession planning is HR's responsibility. And if HR isn't creating a plan or writing a guidebook on how to do succession planning, somehow HR has failed. Number one, that's not succession planning. And number two, it's not HR's responsibility. So the first breakdown in succession planning is understanding whose responsibility it is. It's leadership's, meaning it's the board, if you have a board of directors, and it's the leadership team. Because those two entities, number one, from a fiduciary point of view, it's the part of the board's responsibility to ensure that there is a succession plan in place for the most senior position, and then a couple other positions typically from there, but invariably the senior position. It's leadership's responsibility in that every leader in the organization, from my perspective, should be looking at his or her team on a regular basis to figure out, do we have the current skill sets and capabilities we need to be doing our jobs now? And are we developing the skills we will need to do the jobs we will need to do in the future? And so that's a second breakdown in succession planning. And the third breakdown in succession planning is that quite often organizations believe this is a once and done exercise. And as soon as they create some kind of a document or they filled out something and they've checked the box, they're done. And again, this is why I define and describe succession planning as a mindset versus a process. Because if you create a document, and heaven forbid it's a narrative document that is a book, no one reads it, no one wants to update it, no one's going to follow it. And so, again, the most effective tools that I use with my clients in succession planning, and Lola, here's the big takeaway for anybody that's listening to this: create an org chart and populate your org chart and identify where you have backups and where you don't. And if you can create that visual map, that will serve you better than a 100-page written document on how to do succession planning.
Yeah, I love it. I know nobody reads documents, but visual is very also easy to update as you think about changes in these roles, right? Thank you so much for that. I want to move this to employee resource group example a little bit, because as I shared, that's the space that I kind of live is where, and I hear this phrase thrown around too within the employee resource group community around the strategy, ERG, BRG. We don't have succession plans in place. We struggle with succession. Well, I think the comment is always we struggle with succession. I don't think anybody is thinking about what's the succession plan for these roles. And so how do you see organizations trickling down succession planning and connecting that to leadership development? Because that part is what I see with employee resource groups, where these informal leadership roles sits on the shoulder of one person. I love that phrase, hotspots. There's a hotspot person that's keeping the ERGs going, and then they leave the company and suddenly it feels like everything is going to die off. And why was there no conversation around planning and understanding that this person plays a critical role with something that we want to keep doing? How are we developing our talent pipeline to make sure that these hotspot roles, we have people ready to fill it if anything happens? Because we always assume things will continue like the same way. We never know, right? Change is inevitable.
Well, again, it goes back to succession planning as a mindset. And the other mindset that I work with my clients on is, unless you are the owner of the company and it is your company, you really can't have the mindset of, this is mine. And what I mean by that is, for most of us in leadership positions, we are simply occupying that position until our time in that position is over and we're supposed to transition it to somebody else. That's especially important in the nonprofit world, because you're there during your tenure to carry that mission forward and then transition it to someone else. As a leader, nonprofit or profit or private sector or public sector, you have an obligation while you are in a leadership role, whether it's volunteered or paid, to fulfill that leadership responsibility to allow that organization's mission to move forward. What you should be doing is, during your tenure, there are going to be times when you should go away on vacation. There are going to be times when you're going to be sick and you really shouldn't be responding to work-oriented correspondence or situations. So who is your backup? And in developing leaders, whether it's in an ERG, a nonprofit, or for-profit, or private sector, public sector, the whole idea is if I'm not here, who is my backup? And if any of us think about some of the best leaders we've ever worked for, they're the leaders that helped us develop under them and start to take responsibility for some of the things that we could answer on their behalf when they weren't around. And the best leaders build the strongest teams. So with succession planning and developing leaders, whether it's in an ERG or wherever, it's part of the responsibility before a person transitions out of his or her role is to look at what are you doing to develop the others around you who are supporting you so that they understand their role and they can help you. You're not the lone soldier doing everything. What should you be appropriately delegating out to others? What should you be sharing with others? How should you be helping others grow so that when you transition out, somebody else can seamlessly transition in? Now, here's the other part of it in ERG world also. Whomever the sponsor is should be asking the person whose term is coming up within the next 6 months to end, if they already haven't identified a successor, who have you identified as potential candidates? Why are you identifying them as potential candidates? And what are you doing to develop their skills now to allow them to determine if they want to be a successor and whoever is ultimately selected to be successful as a successor? And to start thinking about that well in advance of a transition set to occur.
Yeah, I like that, and I like that you brought that to ERGs because that's what I'm thinking. Board and executive role in leadership. First, as the board leadership, the organizational leadership. That one question: if I'm not here, how does this continue? Even if it's two people, two different people, is that understanding that breakdown of these are the things that need to happen. If I'm not here, how does it happen? But then bringing it back to ERGs, also another great one because a lot of ERGs have executive sponsors. And sometimes it becomes this gray area where the executive sponsors are sort of like, I'm there. If they need something, they can come to me. And sometimes they miss the point of this role. Like the executive sponsor is there as a guide for these ERG leaders. And you also have oversight of the entire program. So you should be helping them think through what succession looks like. And that I think that also kind of flows into leadership development. So after identifying these three, after seeing some of these hotspots and maybe identifying key areas where there's a gap, what are some of the things that organizations should be looking for when they are identifying potentials and thinking of pipeline development beyond the titles, maybe, or if it's title, I don't know.
So it flows very nicely from what we were just discussing, because I actually had a conversation along these lines with a client earlier this week she applied for a more senior position and is looking to her interviews, and we were talking about how to handle her interview. And Lola, to our conversation here, one of the things I would recommend for any of your current ERG leaders is if their sponsor is not asking them what they are doing to develop their successor or potential successors or others within their ERG with different roles and responsibilities, a key thing that an executive sponsor will look for is if an ERG leader comes to them and says, Lola, I just wanted to remind you that my term is going to end in 6 months. But here's what I'm doing to help identify potential successors, to develop skills in others, to ensure that the system processes and procedures that we're using have been updated for them, and they are helping with that, so that as I transition out and a new successor transitions in, it should be seamless for the ERG, it should be seamless for you. Now, if you think about that, put yourself in the sponsor's shoes for a moment. Most of them are busier than anything. And being a sponsor for an ERG is just one more thing in their full plate of responsibilities. So if you, as the leader of an ERG, come to them with a plan to ensure the ERG's continuity, to ensure that you are developing a potential talent pool of ERG leaders, how does that resonate with an executive? That's huge. You have just kicked open the door for them to see you as a leader in a volunteer capacity, that they can say, oh my gosh, I want her over here. I want her on my team.
I want her on my team. Yep.
And you elevate your profile, you elevate your value, you elevate your capabilities by adding value to the ERG that you have led and that you have started to develop with depth and agility. So it's huge that way. And the same thing applies in any organization. Leaders look to others on their team. Who on my team makes my life easier and who on my team makes my life harder? And when I say makes my life easier or harder, I'm not talking like I'm a diva, you have to serve me. I'm talking about who on my team understands and can do their job and handle it, but who also understands how their job impacts what I need to be doing. And they keep me informed so I'm not blindsided. They help me understand what's important, what's not important, what metrics I need to focus on. Those types of behaviors are what really elevate individuals into the executive's radar to be identified for future leadership positions and opportunities.
Yeah, I love it. And I think it does signal depth, which we talked a little bit about depth, some of the things to develop, because maybe if that's not already top of mind for the executive, now they are thinking, how else can I support this group and this team? Is there an opportunity there? So maybe my next question is more on, we have the struggle, the challenge in the ERG world or in the world of ownership of ERG, where these roles are seen as volunteer roles. And so one of the things you talked about is, I've been talking a lot about how ERGs can be positioned, transformed to be talent pipeline or seen as talent pipeline, because it's a lot in a lot of organizations is a missed opportunity. You have somebody that already works for your organization, somebody that is already committed, and then they're going above and beyond, doing something, leading an initiative within your organization. So as leaders think about succession plan within the organization, what are some ways that maybe ERGs can be elevated to kind of be seen as way more than just volunteer pools for at the organizational level?
I would really suggest that the ERG leaders view themselves and the ERG as problem solvers, not problem reporters. And what I mean by that is, whatever the focus of the ERG is, who are you there to support? Who are you there to elevate? Who are you there to amplify? What's coming out of the ERG that is solution oriented and realistic within the realm of the executive team's purview, the strategies of the organization, the metrics that it's trying to hit, that it needs to hit, and what is coming out of the ERG that supports those initiatives and drives those initiatives, not simply reports issues or challenges and somewhat kicks them up to somebody else to try to now fix.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I love that, it was captured clearly. It was like problem solvers, not problem reporters. And I think that was clear too, because a lot of times we talked about mindset, we talk about solving problems, and sometimes we come to the point of ERGs. We know ERGs do a lot more than they are recognized for. And sometimes bridging that gap also involves doing something that is a little more intentional, as opposed to doing a lot of busy work, doing more strategic work. And I think that's one of it, is what are you solving for, and how are you elevating those solutions to your leadership?
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. As we wrap this up, one of the things I just wanted to give you an opportunity to do is there any final thoughts or words for organizational leaders overall, but also executive sponsors of informal ERG groups and ERG leaders themselves around succession and talent development?
Sure. I think I would summarize a number of things we've talked about. Number one is do not view succession planning as a once and done project. It is a mindset of talent development, leadership development, position development. And it's not just leaders, and that's why I just said position development. Because there are individuals who love being individual contributors and they want to continue to be an individual contributor. And that's great. But if they leave the ERG, if they transition out of the company, who is going to step in and fill that important role that they filled? So succession planning is about talent planning and talent contribution, and it's an ongoing process. That's number one. Number two, what do executive sponsors need to do differently is I think get much clearer with their ERG leaders and to their ERGs, what is the expectation for the most value the ERG can bring to the employee population that they're serving, but also to the organization. And what is that? What does that look like? And how can the sponsor help clear roadblocks to make that happen? For the ERG leaders, I would again amplify the idea of what can you do to demonstrate to others without being asked how you are developing depth, not only for potential ERG leaders, but how are you developing depth with your ERG committee and their individual contributors to ensure that there are seamless transitions between ERG members and ERG leadership. What systems, processes, and procedures are you putting in place, and what talent are you developing to ensure those seamless transitions?
Love it. Thank you so much. Well wrapped up, clear, and hopefully, we have takeaways on across the spectrum around this topic. Thank you so much, Liz, for what you bring to this conversation. Thank you for the work you do. If you're watching live or listening to these, you can connect with Liz through LinkedIn, and I would also drop our email and links in the conversation. But drop your questions in the chat as well. I will be tracking those and do a follow-up with Liz if any question comes up that we're not able to address. But thank you for joining me, Liz. It's been great having you.
Thank you so much, Lola. It's been a pleasure.